Thank you for being here, braving the storm. Thank you for the folks on Zoom who are maybe a little bit wiser than the four of you here. You don't need me to tell you that snow in April is a harbinger for the kind of climate crisis that we're facing. And one of the small things we can do as a town to try and address that and create some ripples of climate leadership is making sure that any future development is as climate neutral as possible. And that's the aim that the state has had throughout its climate action planning and in its sort of promulgation of this specialized opt-in code that Alex, who has been at half a dozen meetings now explaining this, will give us a hopefully final presentation today. Thank you, Alex.
Great, thanks, Josh. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Alex Hasha. I am a board member of Sustainable Milton. I've lived in Milton for 5 years and recently became the chair of the Climate Action Planning Committee as well. So this year, Sustainable Milton is sponsoring this warrant article for the annual town meeting to adopt the specialized building code, which is a set of code updates designed to align with Massachusetts' strategy to get the greenhouse gas pollution that drives global climate change under control by 2050. And so tonight, I want to do a few things. I want to start with overall make the case that adopting the code now is the right choice, not just for Milton, but for our children and future generations. And that case has to begin with the case for accelerating changes in how we build has to begin with the accelerating impacts of climate change. So I'm going to briefly review what's at stake with climate change, and then turn to how Massachusetts is responding and why the specialized building code is a critical component of Massachusetts' overall strategy for achieving a sustainable energy economy and preventing the worst case scenarios of climate change from unfolding. Then we'll get into some of the details of what's actually in the specialized building code and how it's different from our current building code, the stretch code, which it includes. So that's created some confusion, and we'll get into that. And then we also have material, if there's time and interest with this group, on potential cost impacts for a new school. That's certainly a major concern for me as a parent of two children here in town, and I know it's a concern for a lot of people I've spoken to. So why now? Many climate activists talk about saving the planet, but that's never been what motivates me. Earth has gone through immense climate changes many, many times before, and natural climate change over the history of the Earth has caused many mass extinctions, but life always adapts and rebounds. Humans have been around for only a tiny percentage of the Earth's history, but even we've survived ice ages more extreme than the climate shifts that we're facing today. So climate change is nothing new for the planet, but civilization is. In the 200,000 years that humans have walked the earth, we've had agriculture for only 10,000 of those years. And we've had the internal combustion engine for 164 years, a national electric grid for 71 years. On similar timescales, it's been only 79 years since there was a total war between major world powers, and slightly less than that since those powers have had weapons sufficient to wipe all the world's major cities off the face of the earth in an afternoon. So our media diet would have us believe that things have never been worse, but in a lot of material ways, they've never been better. And it's modern technologies, institutions, and infrastructure that have given us an insurance policy against violent storms, bad harvests, and armed aggression that our ancestors could only dream of. But all of those things were designed during and for the relatively stable climate of the recent past. It's the speed, the unprecedented speed of today's climate change when you compare it with the relative novelty of our way of life that's the problem. Climate change doesn't threaten the planet, it threatens our way of life. Now, the impacts are already large and they're growing rapidly. In 2023, the United States had 28 separate climate-related disasters with losses exceeding $1 billion. That's a massive increase from recent history. 1980 to 2023, there was an annual average of 8.5 such events. From 2019 to 2023, that average was 20.4 events. And in recent years, we've started seeing major insurers pulling out of whole state markets over these kinds of issues. Insurance, another one of those institutions designed to buffer us from the vagaries of weather and other risks. With this kind of variability and increasing frequency of major impact, those institutions are strained. And lest you think that this is a problem only in Florida and California, Massachusetts is anticipating serious and costly impacts as well. There will be damage to infrastructure and buildings from extreme storms and heat stress, degradation of ecosystems, reduction in state revenues just as demand for service increases due to climate migration, reduced ability to work outdoors, and rising costs for shelter. By the end of the century, a Massachusetts summer is expected to feel like a Georgia summer does today. And I'll be honest with you, when I hear coverage of specific disasters or regional impacts like these over the next few decades, it does sound serious, but not life-threatening, right? Like, I'd rather Massachusetts didn't feel like Georgia in the summer, but plenty of people move to Georgia of their own free will, and they think it's really great. So doesn't sound like the end of the world, right? It's really, when you start thinking of this in global terms, with the impacts piling up all across the world at the same time, that, at least for me, I start to see that transitioning away from fossil fuels in the long run is not optional for humanity. I did my PhD research on climate models and worked at that time with researchers who studied the long-term worst-case scenarios for climate change. The models that we worked with predicted the increase in extreme heat, storms, droughts, floods, and wildfires that we've been experiencing in recent years, but they also predict the possibility of dramatically more profound, damaging, and irreversible changes whose likelihood increases rapidly the longer our use of fossil fuels continues unchecked. This happens through what climate scientists call tipping points, which are levels of warming beyond which feedback loops in the climate system become self-perpetuating and self-accelerating. The physical mechanisms are things like melting ice sheets, melting permafrost, major changes in ocean currents, ecosystem die-offs. And the possible implications are simply incompatible with our modern way of life. Sea level rise up to 230 feet. Temperatures in Europe could equalize with northern Canada. Regional collapses of fresh water supply and associated crop failures. And in regions of the world that are home to 1 billion people, you could see life-threatening heat waves 250 days out of the year. Now, these kinds of terrible outcomes are by no means certain or immediate, but they're realistic, and their likelihood grows rapidly as we continue down our current path. So it was learning about these things as a graduate student that convinced me that transitioning off of fossil fuels isn't optional. Those of us who've lived in more affluent parts of the world have lived our whole lives with institutions that buffer us from the weather variability that we've known over the last 500 years. But if we continue with the status quo, we can expect these institutions to first strain and then eventually collapse. So this is really what motivates me, maintaining my children's birthright to live in a world with abundant energy, clean water, food, and frankly also relative peace. Because if this is happening all around the world, it's not going to be the weather that gets us. It's going to be all the people whose homes are no longer livable, looking for somewhere to live. So as we get into this specific policy item, zooming in from the really big picture, I want to emphasize that I think the risks of inaction outweigh the risks of action, right? And I acknowledge that there are uncertainties facing us down any path of transitioning our energy systems away from fossil fuels. And we'll surely hear about potential issues with this building code as we get into the details here in town. And as you consider opposing perspectives, I just ask that you keep in mind the risks of inaction. Moving too slowly are very serious indeed. Later is too late. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the reasons for hope, right? Because all that stuff, it's not certain yet, and there is time to address it before those scenarios become extremely likely. We live in a state that's a leader in deploying practical, cost-effective solutions to climate change. Massachusetts has a strategy to get climate warming pollution under control in time to prevent the worst-case scenarios of climate change from unfolding. In 2021, Massachusetts passed a climate bill that commits the Commonwealth to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And that 2050 timeline is based on the science to minimize the risk of worst-case scenarios that we were just talking about. Getting there by 2050 requires starting now with technologies that are available today. Because low emissions fuels aren't economically viable at scale, and dramatic drops in the price of renewable electricity over the last few decades have been really breathtaking, the Massachusetts strategy focuses on electrification. And that means transitioning our buildings and vehicles and other sort of end uses of fossil fuels away from fossil fuels to electricity, while in parallel working to transition the electric grid to clean, renewable energy sources. And meeting the anticipated increase in demand from converting all these fossil fuel uses to electricity requires an aggressive focus on energy efficiency, so that the increase in demand doesn't vastly outstrip the supply. And that's why our current building code, the stretch code, has a strong emphasis on energy efficiency, and we'll talk about that more in a bit. You'll also hear a lot about conserving natural lands and their ability to draw carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and that's very important. It's the net in net zero, absorbing whatever greenhouse gas emissions we can't eliminate by 2050, but it's not enough on its own to make up for what we're currently putting into the atmosphere. And the specialized building code is a critical element of this plan to meet our climate goals. It's necessary because buildings produce 45% of Milton's emissions in 2022. And the specialized building code will help us stop adding to the problem by incentivizing all electric construction and ensuring that new buildings that do use fossil fuels can be easily converted to electricity when it becomes economical in the future. The buildings that we build in the next few years will stand for decades, well beyond 2050, and so they need to be future-proofed. Now let's start digging into the messy details. Massachusetts gives communities the ability to select from 3 standard building codes. Prior to 2022, there were 2 options: a base code that sets a minimum standard and a stretch code with more stringent energy efficiency requirements. And Milton currently uses the stretch code. It was adopted by town meeting in 2010 as a prerequisite to becoming a green community. A year ago, the specialized opt-in code option was added. It was part of the 2021 climate law that be developed, and its intention is to close gaps between the stretch code and the electrification strategy that the state has committed to. So if the proposed warrant article is approved at town meeting, the specialized code would take effect in January 2025. confusing matters, there are also updates to the stretch code, which are automatically taking effect on July 2024. And everybody's getting those two things mixed up, myself included. So we try to make it clear what the distinction is. But this vote does not impact the stretch code updates that are coming in July 2024. Only the additional requirements that are part of the specialized code that would take effect in 2025 if adopted. All three of these codes are based on the International Energy Conservation Code, which is a model code developed by a multinational consortium involving builders, state and municipal governments, and they establish minimum design and construction requirements for energy efficiency. They're updated every 3 years by a public process that brings together experts from across all those industries. So it's not something that a few bureaucrats in the state sort of dream up on their own. It's a broadly used standard across most of the United States. So with that intro, let's dive specifically into what's up for a vote with this warrant article. What's in the specialized code that's not in the stretch code? So top level key points. The new requirements in the specialized code are for new construction only. They incentivize but do not require all electric buildings, which are cost competitive, healthier, and necessary to address climate change for all the reasons we've been discussing. The approach preserves choice for present and future energy needs. If natural gas is the most economical option today, you are still allowed to choose it. But over the lifetime of the building, fossil fuels are unlikely to stay the most cost-effective option. And the specialized code requirements will protect residents from costly construction projects to change over to electricity later on. At a high level, the incremental requirements in the specialized code are pre-wiring for electrification. So new buildings that use fossil fuels need to have adequate electric service and outlets and so forth for, we'll get into that on the next slide for sort of common use cases of fossil fuels in the building. Solar, there's an added solar energy requirement. So new fossil fuel buildings need to install a certain amount of on-site solar to defray the utility costs of the occupants and also offset their emissions. And then it introduces stronger energy efficiency requirements for large homes, that's new single-family homes over 4,000 square feet, and for large multifamily buildings. There's incrementally stronger energy efficiency requirements in the specialized code. So what does pre-wiring mean? It means having adequate electric service in the building with designated circuits and appropriate outlets for heating, hot water, cooking, clothes drying, and electric vehicle charging, which actually is included in the stretch code. So that's not part of the change. Heating might mean like air source heat pumps. They would need a 50 amp circuit. They might not be installed in the new building, but the wiring would need to be there behind the walls during construction so that when the owner at some point wants to install those, that it's not about tearing walls down to make those changes. It's far less expensive to install appropriate wiring during initial construction than to add it later. And for most homes, a 200 amp service is adequate. Mm-hmm. So this is really important, this cost perspective, because builders don't always have an incentive to worry about the long-term trends and energy costs that residents will have to deal with over the lifetime of the building. Today, natural gas is often, but not always, the most inexpensive way to heat a building, with efficient electric heat pumps being a close second. But the trends aren't looking great for fossil fuels. The electrification strategy to eliminate climate warming pollution is enabled by a rapid and continuing drop in the cost of renewable electricity, particularly from solar over the last decade. And our local utilities are investing massively to increase the supply of clean electricity and reduce the cost. And if you probably can't see it, but the y-axis on that bar chart of global clean energy investment, those are trillions of dollars, right? This is a lot of money flowing into producing a lot of clean electricity for the future. On the other hand, Massachusetts has committed to limiting the growth of fossil fuel infrastructure. So as communities around us are transitioning to clean electricity, and 33 other communities have already adopted the specialized code, with at least a dozen more considering it as we speak. As they transition to clean electricity in all electric buildings, the cost of maintaining that existing natural gas infrastructure is falling on a smaller and smaller number of utility customers. So even under pessimistic assumptions for the pace of electrification, natural gas prices are expected to increase significantly in the coming decades. So that's really, I think often you can get stuck in what's the most economical choice right this minute for the upfront costs? But again, these buildings are going to be with us for decades, and if you build in a way that switching to electric heat and electric energy sources is a big, complex, expensive project, that's not good for the residents of those buildings. So I just want to pause for a second on the distinction between the stretch code and the specialized code, because people have heard a lot about the requirements in the stretch code, and it's important to acknowledge those, right? So the specialized code includes all the provisions in the stretch code. So it's true that the home energy efficiency ratings required going from 54 to 42, or don't have the numbers in front of me. That will happen with the specialized code as well, but it's not affected by this vote. Likewise, there are provisions in the stretch code that apply to renovations, typically over like 1,000 square feet or large additions. Those will be there with the specialized code, but they're also in the stretch code, so that's not impacted by this vote. The additional requirements in the specialized code apply only to new residential and commercial construction. So I think we're getting into sort of my resource slides, ones that I don't think it makes sense to talk over in detail. If folks are interested in school cost impacts, we could jump ahead to that. Or I think pausing now for Q&A might be the way to go.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah.
So we wanted to do an open Q&A, and we have additional experts. I'd be calling myself an expert, maybe a stretch. But Alex, as you know, Sustainable Milton Climate Action Planning Committee. We're also joined by Joe Achu, our building commissioner. And on Zoom, we have Dylan Patel, who is at DOER. He is our Regional Green Communities Coordinator. So Dylan is on Zoom, and you can address any question to us. For folks who are attending on Zoom, you can use the Q&A function or raise your hand if you have any questions.
Dare I
Josh,
Please.
I have a question.
Yes, Cheryl.
I understand 30-some communities have adopted the opt-in. Do we have any feedback from those communities about how that's going in their building departments? Where how are you finding like homeowners, design professionals, contractors? Can you need me to do that? I tried to be loud.
You were loud, and I'll repeat for the Zoom.
Okay, thanks. Okay, of the 30-some communities who have adopted the specialized code, is there any feedback on how well it's going, whether the building community, the design community, and the homeowners, and beyond homeowners, so for the larger buildings, how that's going in those communities?
Thanks, Cheryl. So I think that question asks how other communities who've already adopted the specialized code are faring, and I think that's one of the benefits of having our regional Green Communities Coordinator, Dylan, on. So Dylan, do you have some?
Yeah, thank you. So there are 33 communities that have adopted the specialized stretch code, and they are in effect in about 19 of them. So 15 of those 19 came in effect this January. So unfortunately, it's too early to tell because the stretch code kicks in. The specialized stretch code kicks in when you apply for the building permit. So between January and now, there would have been some builders applying for permits, but we don't have, that end of project. It hasn't been long enough for, significant amounts of new construction to have been built in that time. So, and there are 4 towns, see if I can remember them off the top of my head. Watertown, Lexington, I think Arlington and Somerville, if I'm not mistaken. Those came into effect last July. And I know a lot of towns are interested in getting their experience. I have not heard anything from those towns, whether good or bad. So the short answer is it's just too early to tell.
Thanks, Dylan. Oh, yes. Cheryl, you have a follow-up.
I do, for our building commissioner. I'm sure that there's been trainings for building commissioners, and I'm wondering if they're in those trainings or in some discussions with other commissioners who are navigating this, if you've got anything that you've learned from them that could be helpful for people who are taking a look at this.
Sure. So yes, we've had several trainings that are going on through the regional associations. We don't, it comes back to we don't really have enough information to know what this is going to look like once everything fully rolls out. We're dealing more so with the stretch code that's already in place and the changes that are coming up for July 1. That seems to be more on the forefront, seeing that the specialized code isn't statewide yet. So it's really up to the communities and them turning around and either voting for it or not. And then that will set the tone on how our trainings change.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Of course. Any questions from Zoom? You're welcome to raise your hand or use the Q&A function.
Good evening. This is Hale Smith. I have worked fairly closely with an architect who's been very active in the movement for electrification of buildings. And she tells me that the economics of the specialized code, when you take into effect the state and federal credits available for implementing that technology, makes the cost of all electrification almost neutral in terms of traditional HVAC systems. And furthermore, when you look at operating costs after a building has been completed, an all-electric building is far cheaper than traditional fossil fuel-based structures.
Thanks. I know it's a small crowd, but it's good for accessibility. Alex has brought up the slide that I was about to speak on. So DOER, I don't know if Dylan was a part of the study team specifically, but I imagine so. did do a cost-benefit analysis of a number of different types of structures under the stretch code changes, taking into account all the rebates and incentives that are available to them. In Milton, the vast majority of sort of new builds will be relatively large, above 4,000 square feet, which is one of the triggers for different sort of cost mechanisms. And what they found was, for a home builder, it's a net savings of about $20,000 to construct under the stretch code. And for a homeowner and buyer, as sort of an annual net savings of just over $500. So if you take advantage of all those incentives, which can be a challenge for some people, you're going to see savings. And we imagine, if a similar study is being done for the specialized code, and Dylan, maybe you can chime in if you're going to do a specialized code version of this cost-benefit analysis. We intend and sort of expect to see those savings be maintained because the efficiency will be greater and the incentives will remain the same.
Yeah, so this has been a constant request that that towns have put forward to us, and we have put forward to the consultants who did the original study. So we imagine that I can't make any promises on when or if a study on the specialized stretch code will come out, but the consultants that we're working with are aware that this is a constant request, and I would imagine that they're going to start getting some research done at some point this year. Again, we just need a lot more empirical data on this specialized stretch code, and we need to understand what are the construction and operating costs of those units that have been built. Like I said, there are very few at the moment because this is so new. But I just want to emphasize the point. Alex and Josh did a really good job at this, that the cost difference for an all-electric home will be zero, because the cost to build, the design characteristics of a house that's all electric at the specialized code versus the stretch code are exactly the same. The requirements there are no additional requirements. So what you see in the screen right now, you can imagine will be the same for the specialized stretch code. The only thing that would be different is, I think, the federal tax credits are changing. Some of them are becoming a little bit higher. And then you also have the dynamic nature of the operating costs, the fact that electricity prices and gas prices are changing. Right now, as all of you know, it's a lot more expensive per unit of energy for electricity versus gas, but we're going to see that inflection point within the medium term. So heating to an all-electric home will have lower operating costs compared to a gas home. I can foresee in the 2030s.
Thanks, Dylan. And on that final point, when it comes to electricity costs, some of you may have been aware that this is coming at the same time as the renewal of our community electricity aggregation program. The select board chose to renew the program at the same level of renewable energy credits that we were operating at before, which at the Milton Green, which is the standard opt-in rate, is 10% additional renewable energy credits on top of the traditional mix. So we just had our bid day earlier today with our consultants at Good Energy. The nature of energy right now is that it was going to increase. We knew that going in, but the Milton Green new rate is 0.139 cents per kilowatt hour. At basic, goes to 0.135, so relatively minor change for that additional 10%. And then for Milton Green 100, which I know Sustainable Milton has been sort of advocating for, and which, for our climate action planning purposes, we would advocate that residents also participate in, if that is a reasonable financial consideration. It's a limited change. It goes to 1.48 cents per kilowatt hour that's still well below the Eversource rate at 0.17 cents per kilowatt hour. Those savings is legally obligated to say can't be guaranteed because the rates change every 6 months, but we've consistently seen the CEA rates be below Eversource rates. And in our time in the Milton CEA, we've seen savings of just under $9.5 million to the town. So this is huge.
Yeah, historically, electricity prices are much less volatile than fossil fuel prices. Is another. So with our CEA program, we have a much more stability in energy prices. I think a lot of residents didn't even realize that while in Quincy, electricity bills were doubling or tripling after the invasion of Ukraine, that here they stayed the same because of that program. And although the electricity prices were volatile precisely because there's a lot of exposure to natural gas on our grid today, but that's changing. So.
That's a good segue.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts, questions? Folks on Zoom, you're welcome to raise your hands.
Just on that 100%, there can be a tax benefit to folks. So when considering it, consider that as well as an offset to some of the increased costs.
Yeah, and there's guidance on miltoncea.com on how to take advantage of that and the enrollment opportunities, as well as, if may not be of the interest of this crew, if you wanted to opt out, you can also have clear guidance on that on the website. Henry McLean has your hand raised. Henry, welcome to unmute and share a question.
Hi, I just wanted to congratulate you all for putting together such a great presentation. I saw some of this a couple of weeks ago. Alex has been working really hard, and I think all the points made are pointing to the fact that this just should be passed. There's nothing really opposing it in my mind, because the worst part of, or the toughest part for most homeowners in Milton for additions and renovations is already in place. So again, congratulations to you all, and I hope this sails through town meeting next month.
Well, that's up to you all, as I think you may all be town meeting members, to tell your friends, if you're interested in seeing this passed, to recommend they vote. Yes, Hale.
I have a question as to why the warrant committee did not support this article.
Sure.
What were their concerns?
I'll acknowledge it's hardly fair for me to report back on that. So I think they'll express those in the warrant. But I would summarize it primarily a concern that it is new, right? That we don't have the track record experience from other towns to give us confidence that it will roll out smoothly and have as little impact on homeowners as I anticipate. That was a primary concern.
In the meetings where Alex and Joe and I were at to explain, I think the distinction between the stretch code's impacts on additions and renovations were seen as a potential consequence of our adoption of the specialized code, which is not the case.
There was also some anxiety because when you adopt these codes, there is a 3-year update cycle, right? As we were discussing they all rest on this base of the International Energy. I don't have it in front of me, so I'm going to mess up the name. But there's the consortium.
Conservation Code.
Yeah.
The International Energy Code.
The International Energy Code is updated every 3 years. There's a public process for updating the base, stretch, and specialized code. And once you're on the specialized code, whatever it's updated to happens automatically, just like we're experiencing with the stretch code. So there was a lack of trust, I think, with the warrant committee that the specialized code won't be transformed into something really aggressive in the future. I don't think that that's in the state's best interests politically.
And it's not
to
super
pull
light.
a bait and switch like that.
Right. The body is made up of building commissioners and international regulatory bodies. These are not known for their high risk tolerance and sort of progressivism when it comes to these kinds of things. So it's very rigorously tested before these are adopted. Joe can speak to, these codes are not just done willy-nilly by a bunch of 20-year-olds.
No, the codes are updated every 3 years. They're on a cycle. We're coming into the 10th edition building code, so there's nothing new there. When these codes come in, Massachusetts has its own amendments, so it's not just the regular base code that you get and you open the book and there it is. Massachusetts has its amendments to just about everything, plumbing code, electric, whatever it may be. And the energy code is subject to that just as well, so that's why we have the stretch energy code. So you have the base code, then the stretch. Obviously, everybody that wanted to do it and become a green community adopted it, and then the stretch energy code is updated just like the rest of the building code on a cycle. Every 3 years. Everything's usually implemented, comes out for January 1st, and by July 1st, it's all kicked into place. And there's usually a concurrency period that runs for about 6 months, and then everything's back on track. And then that cycle starts all over again as soon as you say, yeah, I'll take this, you get the next one 3 years later. Those cycles happen regularly. They've been happening for years. And it's just the way to keep track with all the different types of building products out there, the different types of mechanical systems that are out there for heating and cooling. Technology is changing all the time. Everything's, building design changes all the time. So with that, we have to change with the times. So everything that we're doing and that I enforce on a daily basis is currently in an influx of whether or not it's going to be, something new that's coming along, new products that are coming out there that can be utilized because they get a higher strength or material basis or anything like that. So, and the energy code is no different. I think personally, that the opt-in specialized code is a good thing. It's all new construction only. And I think there's been a little bit of confusion when people hear new construction and they think, well, I'm putting an addition on my house. That's new construction. That falls under the stretch code, which we already have in place. And if you're doing 1,000 square feet or more, you're going to have to update, not only that, but the entire house. And that has to come through when you have to go for the HERS rating. And there's a whole thing behind that too, and it comes down to, do you update mechanical systems, do you update insulation, is it building products? It's a whole bunch of stuff, and it's never looked at as just one piece. So those are the types of things that need to be looked at. But I think the specialized code is a good direction to go in, and that's my take from all the years of service I've done. So.
In Milton, about how many homes would this apply to that are over 4,000 square feet, brand new construction?
Great question, Cheryl. It's as if I had planned that because I have the number pulled up. That's a question that Alex had asked us in this process.
Because Cheryl asked me.
Because Cheryl asked. It all comes back. I worked with our GIS specialist, Alan Bishop, to see how many new buildings had been constructed since we adopted this stretch code originally. So since 2011, when it came into effect, how much had the stretch code affected our development and about a decade worth of development history. There were in total 194 new constructions in those 13 years. The vast majority of them, 174, were residential construction. And the vast majority of those, 166, were above 4,000 square feet. Joe can also speak to the trends we're seeing in terms of what building permits go in. People are looking to build larger homes and expand their homes. So we expect to see residential buildings be the primary sort of driver of this, and residential buildings over 4,000 square feet to be the sort of standard use case. That being said, I've used the words vast majority, and that maybe implies a large number. I mean, this breaks down to an average of 13 new buildings every year over the last 13 years.
I just want to say one point to that, though, is that if you have a house that is 3,500 square feet and you put a 500 square foot addition on there, it does not bump you into the 4,000 square foot mark. It only, the way the code would look at it is that it's a 500 square foot addition, and that's all we would focus on for the stretch code to apply to the house. Not that your house is now 4,000 square feet and you have to meet the specialized opt-in code.
That's a great point, Joe.
Yeah, that was kind of what I was wondering too, because it seems to me 13 totally new homes at over 4,000 square feet is a lot. I'm wondering, do you think in the last year we've had that many that weren't additions, that were purely, maybe there was a tear down and new construction?
Probably new build, I'd say probably a handful. Yeah.
That's kind of what I would have thought, more than 13, but
Yeah. There have been 4 so far, 2024, and 4 in 2023. I think we're getting to the end of the Q&A, Sean, but I appreciate your diligence to our audio quality.
So a question I've gotten frequently is about the impact to the grid of all electric construction, and like what if the power goes out? And so just a couple answers to that I think are worth saying in this forum too. It's the focus on energy efficiency that's in the stretch code is there by design to constrain the load growth. So again, it's not a huge number of buildings as far as the Milton grid is concerned in any given year. But they're also going to be highly energy efficient buildings. So Eversource is anticipating a peak demand increase of only 5% under full electrification when combined with these energy efficiency improvements in the building code. And has, again, we saw that investment chart. Like they have filed plans and they are working hard on expanding the grid's capacity by 180% to support this strategy. And if the power goes out, especially for larger buildings, it's important to know that a fossil fuel backup generator does not trigger the sort of fossil fuel compliance pathways. So you can have an all-electric building that has a natural gas generator backup. And so it's particularly when you start talking about large municipal buildings like a school, the towns that are building all-electric, net zero schools today are installing big natural gas backup generators. But the carbon footprint of that is acceptable because it almost never runs.
But we have just completed a feasibility analysis of some microgrid systems at municipal structures. Town Hall, Milton Police Headquarters, as well as Winter Valley, we brought in an energy consultant to test the loads and see what the capacity would be for each of those buildings to have on-site solar generation and battery energy storage, so that we could rely not just on these pretty aggressive, loud, and heavily polluting generators, but have battery energy storage that is complementary and provides us with cleaner backup power, as well as allows us at peak moments on the grid when costs are increased to switch to the local generation and lower our costs. So some schools that have gone all electric have also looked at that model for battery energy storage to maximize the efficiency and renewability of these new developments.
Yeah. So just to take a step back, I mean, there's a lot of building technology and energy technology. It's changing. There's a lot of, depending on your perspective, exciting engineering challenges or maybe irritating engineering challenges. Change is always hard. But I think back to the sort of aggressive increase in fuel efficiency for cars after the oil crisis in the 70s. That was controversial too. There were a lot of people saying, "Oh, this can't be done," but it was done, right? And now we're used to it's hard to imagine what we'd be paying at the pump
Yeah.
for a typical commute if that hadn't happened, right? So I think by taking a step like this, you create the certainty and the sort of mandate in the marketplace for these problems to get solved quickly, and to scale up the market for the associated technologies and accelerate the transition, which ultimately we need to do for our children and their children.
Yeah, all communities at some point to meet the state's goals ought to be moving towards, electrification as broadly as possible, towards net zero policies. And as we do that, as we are a leader, that provides the impetus for the job training, for the sort of market growth for individual products and sort of technologies to grow. I mean, this is a necessary step for the energy efficiency to actually happen once we put these laws into place. And I also, speaking of laws into place, your last point here, there are a couple of sort of development-related laws and statutes that people worry about in terms of their economic and environmental impact. And we want to be really clear that while a lot of sort of zoning provisions don't apply to a 40B project, the building code does. So new 40B developments would be subject to the specialized code if they were built after we adopt this code. Similarly, at some point, we're still operating under the assumption that we will have a MBTA community zoning compliant district. Those developments will need to be compliant with this specialized code. So there are sort of increasing developmental pressures that this specialized code can help sort of allay the environmental concerns that they bring.
How many other communities are considering that for their spring town meetings?
Oh, at the springtime meeting, Dylan?
10. So I'm working with about a dozen or to a baker's dozen right now, of which 2 or 3 are have notified me that they're going to wait for the fall, or might go into next year. So it's between 8 and 10 within my region, within the Northeast region, and probably about a good 6 or 7 with from the rest of the state. So I'm thinking by May we might have 15, or June, we may have about 15 communities putting this in to the town meeting or to the city council. It's going through the city council in one city currently, Newburyport, and I've had about 5, 6, I can't keep up at this point, public meetings with other towns within the Northeast region.
Well, we appreciate your time joining us tonight as well, Dylan. I know you're bouncing between a lot of communities. And I can also report that Somerville is a specialized code community, so I'll give us some updates as to how that works for my next job.
I have a question. Where is the best source of information about the proposed, about the specialized stretch codes for anyone in general who wanted to know, but in particular town meeting members?
Great question. So I will bring it up on my screen so you can all see it. But we have a energy codes page on townofmilton.org. That's under our communities tab. Oh, it's on. I'm sharing mine. My screen share is loading.
Let me get over to it.
So on the Newtown website, there's a community tab that has a lot of generally sort of asked questions that aren't specifically answered by the work of any particular committee or department. And we've done a lot of work over the last 6 months to build a really robust resilience and sustainability portion to that webpage. Yeah, so Stretch Energy Codes is the webpage that we've been hosting all of the information that we've shared. So all of my presentations, all of Alex's presentations live on that website. And it also links to Dylan's excellent webpage that DOER runs on the building energy codes. It gives you the language of this specific code, which we also have copied here, Regulation 225 CMR 22 and 23. There's also a resource at the bottom here that was prepared by Acton, Arlington, and Lexington, which is a nice, handy resource guide for communities who are doing the opt-in specialized code, as well as those doing a sort of broader range of energy efficiency work. So it's a really solid resource that I've been able to draw a lot of good feedback from. DOER has an FAQs document, which we've linked to here. So this is what we've provided, but it's also linking to other really good resources like the states or like other leading towns. The presentation and the recording of tonight's meeting will be put on here tomorrow.
And the actual warrant is coming out.
Quite soon. There was one in our printer this morning, but I don't know if that was the final version.
Okay.
The warrant will have the warrant committee's recommendation and their language. I have not seen that language and their specific rationale for their no recommendation. But when you are at town meeting, the town administrator has assured me that it won't be a complex process of having to take a no vote if you're pro the specialized code. You won't have to vote on the warrant committee's recommendation. The moderator will operate an affirmative vote. So if you vote yes, you're voting yes on adopting the specialized code. There's not any double or sometimes triple negatives that town meeting sometimes creates. I will also point to Sustainable Milton has some good resources. Alex recently released a video which contains a lot of the information on that he shared today that provides additional background and a calming, soothing narration. If a 15-minute or 5-minute video is more to your speed rather than braving the sleet of today or taking your time to join us on Zoom. We won't be putting it on the website because it does have a call for voting yes on the article, and for our purposes, we are sort of providing information but not advocacy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, Dylan, for joining us remotely. Thank you, Alex, for hours and hours and hours. You were at master plan, warrant committees, more warrant committees, select board, and Joe as well. I know you have a long way home to go, so I appreciate you sticking around for us.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh, for your work.